Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku never met All Might. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The scent of burnt sugar hung in the air, a cloying, sickly sweet perfume that clung to the singed edges of Izuku Midoriya's notebook. He clutched Hero Analysis for the Future No. 13 to his chest as if it were a holy text, its pages a testament to a faith that was, minute by minute, being tested by fire. You're quirkless. Kaken's voice, sharp and explosive as the miniature blasts he set off in his palm, still echoed in his ears. You think you can rub shoulders with me at UA? You're worse than the rest of these damn rejects, you useless Deku. The laughter of his classmates had been the gasoline on the fire. Izuku's feet scuffed against the pavement of the underpass, the rhythmic sound a dull counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart. The tunnel offered a brief, cool respite from the afternoon sun, but the shadows felt long and menacing today. He replayed the scene for the 10th time, the notebook flying from his hands, landing with a splash in the koi pond, Kaken's parting shot, a sneering suggestion that he take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in his next life. He'd flinched, of course. He always did. But a strange, defiant spark had flickered in his chest. He can't say that. That's inciting suicide. What if I really did it? He'd be in so much trouble. The thought was analytical, detached, a defense mechanism his brain had perfected over years of torment. He would dissect the cruelty, categorize it, file it away. It was easier than feeling the full, crushing weight of it. He hugged the notebook tighter. It was damp, the ink bleeding on some of the pages, but it was his. It was everything. His dreams, his hopes, his life's work, all bound in cheap paper and filled with frantic, adoring script. He could still be a hero. He just had to believe. All Might said anyone could be a hero. All Might wouldn't lie. A sound behind him, wet and guttural, like a drain backing up, broke his train of thought. He turned, his brow furrowed in curiosity. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of raw sewage and decay. From the manhole cover in the center of the tunnel, a grotesque form was rising. It was a shifting, bubbling mass of putrid green sludge, with two enormous, manic eyes floating in the morass like boiled eggs in a rancid soup. A wide, toothy grin stretched across the fluid entity, a horrifying parody of human expression. A medium-sized invisibility cloak, the creature gurgled, its voice a slurry of liquid and malice. The two colossal eyes swiveled and fixed on him. On Izuku. Izuku's blood ran cold. His feet were suddenly bolted to the concrete. Every hero-worshipping, analysis-obsessed fiber of his being screamed villain. But his body refused to respond. Fight or flight? He'd chosen neither. He was frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated terror. You'll do, the sludge villain rasped and lunged. It wasn't a solid impact. It was an engulfing. The world dissolved into a suffocating, viscous green. The stench was overpowering, burning his nostrils and throat. The sludge forced its way into his mouth, his nose, a horrifying tide of filth filling his lungs. He clawed at it, his fingers sinking into the semi-liquid body with no purchase. It was like trying to fight water. It yielded and then immediately consumed, pulling his flailing limbs deeper into its mass. Can't breathe. Panic, hot and sharp, pierced through his paralysis. His body thrashed uselessly. His vision began to swim, black spots dancing at the edges of the murky green. His lungs burned, screaming for air that wasn't there. My body, getting weak. He could feel his own strength fading, the futile struggle becoming weaker, more pathetic. Am I dying? Is this it? In the haze of oxygen deprivation, his life didn't flash before his eyes. Instead, a single, devastating thought surfaced. I'm dying before I even got to try. He was just Deku. The useless, quirkless kid who was a burden to his worried mother, and a punching bag for his childhood friend. He would die here, in a dark underpass, suffocated by a sewer monster, and his last act would be one of utter, helpless failure. No, somebody. His desperate, silent plea was a prayer to any god that would listen, to any hero who might be near. He thought of All Might's brilliant smile, a beacon in the terrifying darkness that was closing in. Help me, Just as the black spots converged and his consciousness began to fray, a metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. "Halt, villain!" A voice boomed, not with the resonant, godlike power of All Might, but with the grit and volume of a seasoned brawler. The pressure around Izuku lessened slightly. A figure stood at the tunnel's entrance, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He was powerfully built, clad in a hero costume that was more functional than flashy: dark pants, a sturdy orange harness, and massive, piston-like gauntlets over his arms. Death Arms, a top 10 hero known for his raw, straightforward power. The sludge villain recoiled, a gurgling snarl emanating from its form. "Stay back, or the kid gets it." "Not happening," Death Arms grunted, and charged. He wasn't a blur of speed, he was a freight train of muscle and determination. He closed the distance in 3 powerful strides, his right fist cocked back. Izuku felt a violent tearing sensation as the hero's gauntlet hand plunged into the villain's mass, seeking purchase. Death Arms grabbed a fistful of Izuku's backpack, the only solid thing to hold on to, and pulled. The force was jarring, ripping Izuku from the villain's suffocating embrace. He landed on the concrete in a heap, gasping, coughing, retching up bile and foul-smelling sludge. Air. Sweet, beautiful, life-giving air flooded his burning lungs. He coughed until his ribs ached, his eyes streaming with tears of relief and pain. Behind him, the fight was brutally short. Death Arms wasn't trying to be elegant. He delivered a series of rapid, powerful punches that seemed to disorient and compact the villain's liquid form. With a final, decisive move, he grabbed a discarded 2-liter soda bottle from a nearby bin, uncapped it, and with surprising dexterity, forced the stunned and semi-solid villain into the plastic container. He screwed the cap on tight, the villain's furious, disembodied eyes glaring from within. The hero stood, breathing a little heavily, and turned his attention to Izuku. "You alright, kid?" Izuku looked up, his vision still blurry with tears. A real pro-hero. He'd just been saved by a real pro-hero. The awe for a moment eclipsed the terror. He scrambled for his notebook, which had been knocked from his grasp. His hands trembled as he opened it to a clean page. P-Pro. Pro-hero Death Arms. He stammered, his voice raw. "See, can I have your autograph?" Death Arms blinked, a flicker of surprise on his rugged face. "Kid, you almost just died. An autograph is the first thing on your mind?" He let out a short, humorless chuckle and took the pen Izuku offered. He signed the page with a quick, practiced scrawl. "You're a real fanboy, huh?" This was it. This was his chance. It wasn't All Might, but he was a pro. He knew the business. He would know the answer. The question that had been the sun and moon of Izuku's existence, the question that had fueled every page of every notebook, bubbled up from the depths of his soul. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. Actually, he began, bowing his head so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. "I have a question. It's something I have to know." He squeezed his eyes shut, as if not seeing the hero's reaction would soften the blow if the answer was wrong. "Is it possible to become a hero, even if I don't have a quirk?" The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It stretched for an eternity. Izuku could hear the drip of water from the tunnel ceiling, the distant hum of city traffic. He held his breath, his entire world hanging on the next words to leave this man's lips. Death Arms started, then stopped. He let out a long, weary sigh. It wasn't a sigh of annoyance or ridicule. It was the sound of a man who had seen too much, a man who had to deliver bad news one too many times. It was a sigh of profound, crushing pity. That sound hurt more than Kaken's explosions ever could. "Kid, look at me," the hero said, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier bravado. Izuku slowly, reluctantly, raised his head. Death Arms' expression was grim, his eyes holding a stark, unflinching realism. There was no bright smile, no booming reassurance. There was only the hard, unvarnished truth. "I'm gonna be straight with you," he said, crouching slightly to meet Izuku's gaze. "Because blowing smoke and giving you false hope would be crueler than telling you the truth right now. So listen." The answer is no. The word landed like a physical blow, knocking the wind from Izuku's already aching lungs. No. It was so simple. So final. But, All Might said. Izuku whispered, the words catching in his throat. All Might is a symbol, Death Arms interrupted, not unkindly. He inspires people. That's his job. My job is to be on the street, to deal with the messes. And I'm telling you, from the street level, it's impossible. He gestured with a thumb towards his own muscular arms. My quirk isn't flashy. It's just enhanced strength. But it's my primary tool. When a wall is between me and a civilian, I go through it. When a getaway car is speeding off, I can stop it. A quirk isn't just a superpower, kid. For a hero, it's the baseline. It's the bare minimum requirement to even stand on the field. Izuku's mind, his traitorous, analytical mind, started whirring, trying to find a counterargument, a loophole. But what about gear? Or strategy? What about? As if reading his thoughts, Death Arms continued. You've got a good brain, I can tell. You're analyzing things, I see it in your eyes. But strategy doesn't stop a bullet. A clever plan doesn't help you when a building is collapsing on your head, and you can't lift the rubble. We face villains with quirks that can level city blocks. We run into fires, we deal with poisons, we fight people who can move faster than sound. Without a quirk of your own to act as a weapon, a shield, or a means of escape, you're not just a hero with a handicap. You're a liability. The word hung in the air between them. Liability. You'd be a civilian we have to protect while we're trying to stop the villain. You'd get yourself killed, or worse, you'd get someone else killed. A partner, a hostage, someone. He straightened up, his shadow seeming to swallow Izuku whole. It's a dangerous, brutal job, kid. We lose people even with powerful quirks. Sending a quirkless person out there, it's not heroic. It's suicide. He paused, and his expression softened again, a hint of genuine sympathy in his eyes. Look, you clearly have a drive to help people. That's a good thing. A noble thing. Have you ever thought about being a police officer? They're heroes. They work with us every day. Your mind for analysis would be incredible for detective work. You could solve cases, put villains behind bars, save people that way. That's a real, tangible way you can help. He gave Izuku's shoulder a firm, paternal pat. It wasn't a gesture of encouragement. It was one of finality. A dismissal. Don't get yourself killed chasing a fantasy, he said, his voice returning to its gruff, professional tone. Find a different way to be a good person. Now I've got to get this guy to the station and file a report. And with that, he turned and walked away, the sludge-filled bottle swinging gently at his side. He didn't look back. Izuku stood frozen in the middle of the underpass, the hero's autograph a cruel joke on the page. The words echoed in the sudden emptiness. No. Impossible. Liability. Suicide. Chase a fantasy. Each word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the very foundation of his identity. His dream, once a brilliant, towering skyscraper of hope, crumbled into dust and rubble around him. He was left standing in the ruins, a ghost in his own life. The tears that had been welling in his eyes didn't fall. It was a grief too deep for tears. It was a hollowing out, a quiet and complete devastation of the soul. He didn't know how long he stood there. The sun had shifted, and the shadows were gone, but the world had lost its color anyway. He began to walk, his legs moving on pure muscle memory. He was a marionette whose strings had been cut, stumbling forward without purpose. Then he heard it. A distant explosion. Then another. A flicker of instinct, the ingrained reflex of a lifetime of hero worship, pulled him. His feet, against his conscious will, began to move faster, turning a corner, then another, following the sounds of chaos and the sight of smoke curling into the sky. He found the source in a crowded shopping district. A throng of onlookers was held back by police tape. Fire hydrants had been blasted open, sending arcs of water into the street. Flames licked at the entrance of a convenience store. And in the center of it all, thrashing and creating explosions, was the very same sludge villain. He must have escaped. Death Arms must have dropped the bottle. Izuku's stomach churned with a sick feeling of responsibility. This is my fault. Then he saw who the villain had captured. The spiky blonde hair was unmistakable. The furious, terrified red eyes belonged to only one person, Kaken. The heroes on the scene were struggling. Kamui Woods was there, but the fire kept him at bay. His wooden form was too vulnerable. Mount Lady couldn't get close without destroying the entire street. Backdraft was doing his best to contain the flames, but the villain was using Bakugo's own explosion quirk, creating uncontrolled blasts that hampered any rescue effort. Izuku's analytical mind took over, a cold, desperate process running in the background of his despair. Kamui is weak to fire. Mount Lady's quirk is useless in a confined space. Backdraft is purely defensive. They need a hero with a direct, overwhelming power or a non-physical quirk to disable the villain. They're failing. He saw it. An opening. The villain's eyes, his weak point, were momentarily exposed as he focused on controlling Bakugo. A well-aimed projectile, a rock, a can, even his own backpack, could create a momentary distraction. It could give Bakugo the split second he needed to breathe, to fight back. Izuku took a step forward. His hand tightened on the strap of his yellow backpack. He could do it. He could help. Liability. Death Arm's voice echoed in his mind, a spectral chain yanking him back. You'd just be another civilian we have to protect. His foot froze mid-step. His body locked up. He was just a spectator in the crowd, a face among hundreds, all watching, all useless. He saw the desperation in Kaken's eyes, the same terror he himself had felt just a short time ago. And he did nothing. He stood there, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white, a silent, choked scream trapped in his chest. His dream was to save people with a smile. But here he was, watching his oldest friend suffocate, and he couldn't even move. The chasm between his dream and his reality had never been so stark, so absolute. Suddenly, the crowd gasped. The air pressure shifted. A voice, a sound so powerful it felt like it could rearrange the atoms in the air, cut through the chaos. Have no fear. Why? A massive figure landed between the heroes and the villain, his back to the crowd. The iconic V-shaped hair, the towering wall of muscle, the costume of red, white, and blue. Because I am here, All Might. It wasn't like Death Arm's arrival. This wasn't a hero showing up to do a job. This was a god descending from the heavens. The crowd roared, their fear instantly replaced with euphoric adoration. Izuku watched, numb. All Might was here. The #1 hero. The symbol of peace. His idol. And Izuku felt nothing but a vast, empty distance. All Might hadn't come for him. He was a force of nature, an event, an answer to the city's prayers. Texas smash. All Might's fist shot forward. It didn't even need to connect. The punch itself generated a hurricane. The sheer air pressure was a physical blow, atomizing the sludge villain and blasting him off of Bakugo. The force was so immense, it changed the weather. The clouds overhead swirled and parted. A few drops of rain began to fall from a suddenly clear sky. It was over in an instant. Bakugo was safe, gasping on the ground. The villain was scattered into harmless puddles. The fire was extinguished by the sudden downpour. The aftermath was a media frenzy. Reporters swarmed All Might, microphones and cameras thrust in his face. He struck a heroic pose, his signature, unwavering smile plastered on his face. Everything is fine now, citizens. His voice boomed, projecting for the news. Why? Because I am. He was mobbed before he could finish. Izuku stood at the very back of the crowd, completely invisible. He watched his idol, the man whose words he had clung to for a decade, being interviewed. He saw the perfect smile, heard the confident, prepackaged answers. There was no opening. There was no chance to ask his question. He was just a boy in a crowd, and All Might was a star in a distant galaxy. The gap between them was not something that could be crossed by determination or hard work. It was a fundamental law of the universe. All Might was a god. Izuku was a quirkless, useless Deku. He didn't even try to push forward. He just turned and walked away, letting the adoring crowd swallow the space where he had stood. The walk home was a silent funeral procession for a dream. The world was a muted, meaningless gray. When he finally arrived, his mother, Inko, met him at the door. Her perpetually worried face crumpled in on itself when she saw the state of him. The soot on his cheek, the vacant look in his eyes, the damp, singed notebook clutched in his hand. Izuku! What happened? Are you okay? I saw the news, the villain attacked near your route. I'm fine, Mom, he mumbled, his voice flat and lifeless. He pushed past her, leaving her standing in the entryway with 1,000 unasked questions hanging in the air. At dinner, she'd made his favorite, katsudon, a peace offering he couldn't accept. She tried to fill the suffocating silence with cheerful chatter. That All Might, he's just so amazing, isn't he? To change the weather with a single punch. It's incredible. He saved that boy. Izuku just stared at his food, pushing a piece of pork around his bowl with his chopsticks. Every word was a grain of salt being rubbed into the raw, gaping wound in his chest. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't bear to see the pity in her eyes, to hear her say the words she'd tearfully sobbed when he was 4 years old. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry. He excused himself, leaving a nearly full bowl behind, and retreated to the sanctuary that had overnight become a tomb. His room was a shrine to a dead god. All Might posters grinned down at him from every wall. All Might figurines stood in heroic poses on his shelves. The All Might computer background radiated a hope that felt like a mockery. He looked at it all, and for the first time in his life, he felt an alien bitterness coiling in his gut. It was all a lie. A beautiful, heroic, wonderful lie sold to children to make them feel safe. He sat at his desk, the desk lamp casting a small, lonely circle of light in the growing darkness. He opened the notebook. Hero Analysis for the Future number 13. The title was pathetic. A child's fantasy. He stared at the words, his vision blurring. He thought of the underpass. He thought of Death Arm's blunt, brutal honesty. He thought of the second villain attack, of seeing Kakin in the same suffocating grip. He thought of his own paralysis, the way his body had refused to move, chained by the label of liability. But his mind hadn't been chained. Even as he stood frozen, he had been analyzing. Kamui is weak to fire. Mount Lady can't fit. The villain's eyes are his weak point. They need to create a distraction. The analysis had been correct. The strategy had been sound. The problem wasn't his brain. The problem was the goal. The problem was the title on the notebook. He didn't need a license, a costume, or public approval to know how to stop a villain. He just needed to be able to act. The system had told him no. The heroes had told him no. The world had told him he was not allowed to participate. So be it. If he couldn't join their game, he would play a different one. In the alleys, in the shadows. Where there were no rules, no licenses, no prerequisites. There was only the problem and the solution. The person in danger, and the one who helps. A grim, terrifying resolve began to solidify in the hollow space where his dream used to be. It wasn't bright and hopeful like his old ambition. It was cold, sharp, and pragmatic. He picked up a thick, black permanent marker from his desk drawer. The cap came off with a decisive click. His hand, which had been trembling all afternoon, was now perfectly steady. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew a thick black line through the words Hero Analysis for the Future. The ink was dark and absolute, obscuring the childish lettering beneath. It was an execution. Then, in the space above the blacked-out title, he wrote new words. His handwriting was no longer the frantic scrawl of a fanba. It was sharp, angular, and chillingly precise. Vigilante Analysis, Tactics, Weaknesses, and Exploits. He stared at the new title. It felt right. It felt real. He turned to the first blank page. He didn't sketch a hero's costume or write down their ultimate moves. He wrote a new heading, clinical and detached. Subject, Sludge Villain. Incident 2 Analysis Non-Quirk Counter-Strategy. The pen began to move, the scratching sound the only noise in the silent, all-might-themed room. 1. Physical composition, semi-liquid colloidal suspension. High viscosity, but no stable form. Vulnerable to rapid, widespread changes in temperature or pH. 2. Primary weakness, solid ocular components. These appear to be the core of its consciousness and sensory input. They are a physical target. 3. Proposed counter-strategy, quirkless operative standard issue fire extinguisher. Contains compressed CO2. Upon release, rapid expansion and sublimation cause drastic temperature drop, -78 degrees Celsius. A direct, sustained blast would cause localized freezing of the villain's body, creating solid masses and inducing thermal shock. A direct hit to the eyes would likely cause temporary solidification and total blindness, providing a window for hostage extraction. 4. Environmental exploit. Incident occurred in a shopping district. Every commercial building is required by law to have multiple fire extinguishers. Access is public. A fast operative could acquire one in under 30 seconds. Izuku Midoriya wrote long into the night, his face illuminated by the solitary glow of his desk lamp. The boy who had wanted to be a hero was gone, suffocated in a dark tunnel. In his place sat a shadow, a ghost, a quiet analyst preparing for a war he now intended to fight on his own terms. The dream was dead. A purpose had just been born. 6 months passed. 6 months in which the world continued to turn, heroes continued to debut, and Izuku Midoriya ceased to exist. Oh, a boy with his face still attended Aldera Junior High. A boy with his name still sat at the dinner table across from his mother, but the light in his eyes, the frantic, hopeful energy that had once defined him, was gone. It had been snuffed out in a dark underpass and buried under the weight of a single, sensible word, liability. The Izuku that remained was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. At school, he was no longer the target. The silence that now surrounded him was a far more potent deterrent than his previous flinching and stammering had ever been. He moved through the hallways with a quiet, unnerving purpose, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that no one else could see. He didn't mutter anymore, not out loud, at least. The endless stream of analysis now flowed silently behind his eyes, a constant, churning river of data. Bakugo watched him sometimes, a flicker of confusion and irritation in his crimson eyes. He had expected Deku to crumble, to cry, to fade into utter patheticness. Instead, the useless nerd had become blank. An empty page. And that, more than anything, seemed to enrage him. At home, the change was a quiet tragedy. Inko Midoriya tried her best. She made his favorite meals, asked about his day, and tried to talk about the latest hero news, hoping to see a spark of the old Izuku. All she received were short, non-committal answers. "How was school, sweetie?" she'd ask, her voice bright with a hope that dwindled a little more each day. "Fine," Izuku would reply, not looking up from his textbook. "I saw that new hero, Edgeshot, was on the news. His quirk is so interesting, don't you think? It's efficient for infiltration," he'd state, the observation clinical, stripped of all wonder. "But it likely has a high caloric cost to maintain density at such thinness." Then he would retreat to his room, and the door would click shut, a sound that echoed like a vault being sealed. The All Might posters were still on the walls, but they felt like relics of a past life, left up as a form of camouflage. If his mother saw he'd taken them down, she would worry more, and he couldn't afford her worrying. He couldn't afford her looking too closely at what he was becoming in the dead of night. For when the sun went down and the city lights began to glitter, the ghost of Izuku Midoriya came alive. His nights were a ritual of obsessive self-education. His computer screen, once a portal to hero forums and All Might tribute videos, was now a window into the city's dark underbelly. He learned to read police scanner codes, differentiating between a domestic disturbance and an armed robbery by the clipped, professional jargon. He mapped crime statistics, overlaying them with hero patrol routes he'd memorized, identifying the blind spots, the seams in the fabric of civic safety. He devoured textbooks on forensic science, criminology, and urban warfare tactics. The physical training was the most grueling part. He had no mentor, no gym, no guidance. He had only online videos, his own analytical mind, and a grim determination that bordered on self-punishment. His chosen training ground was the Goba Municipal Beach Park, the same one All Might would, in another life, have tasked him with cleaning. But Izuku wasn't there to clean it. He was there to use it. The mountains of illegally dumped trash, the rusted cars, the broken appliances, the tangled webs of rebar and cable, became his personal obstacle course. He taught himself to run on unstable surfaces, to balance on narrow beams, to climb. His first attempts at parkour were disastrous. He fell, he bruised, he scraped his skin raw. Each failure was a reminder of Death Arm's words. Liability. Suicide. Each time he hauled his aching body back up, it was an act of defiance. He would not be a liability. He would become the opposite. He would become an asset, unseen and uncredited. His muscles, once soft and undefined, became lean and corded with wiry strength. His hands, once only accustomed to holding a pen, grew rough with calluses. He was still small, still unassuming, but his body now moved with a new economy of motion, a quiet efficiency born from endless, painful repetition. And then there was the gear. His meager allowance, supplemented by cash from running errands for neighbors and sorting recyclables for a small fee, was funneled into his new, secret purpose. He wasn't building a hero costume. He was assembling a toolkit for a ghost. His boots were cheap, steel-toed work boots he'd bought from a second-hand store, the leather scuffed but the protective caps solid. He'd reinforced the soles with layers of cut-up rubber tires, glued and stitched together to dampen the sound of his footsteps. His gloves were gardening gloves, but he'd painstakingly stitched thin plates of scrap metal over the knuckles and backs of the hands. They wouldn't stop a bullet, but they might turn a knife or let him punch through a window without shredding his skin. He spent weeks on his primary tools of misdirection. He bought cheap smoke pellets from a novelty magic shop online, then spent hours in his room with the window wide open, carefully breaking them down and repacking them with a pinch of chili powder. The result was a small, throwable canister that would produce a cloud of thick, acrid smoke that also served as a potent irritant. His caltrops were a bag of 100 large, industrial ball bearings purchased from a hardware supplier. Simple, silent, and brutally effective against the pursuing opponent on a hard surface. His prized creation, however, was his grappling hook. The parts were scavenged from the metallic wasteland of Dagoba, a heavy-duty winch motor from a wrecked Jeep, a length of high-tensile carbon fiber wire from a discarded piece of industrial machinery, and a four-pronged hook he'd hammered and welded into shape himself over a small butane torch, the acrid smell of burning paint filling his lungs. It was ugly, bulky, and temperamental. He'd spent 3 nights just testing the launch mechanism, the hook either firing with the force of a cannon or flopping uselessly to the ground. But finally, he'd calibrated it. It was loud, and the recoil was jarring enough to nearly dislocate his shoulder. But it worked. It was his key to the city's vertical world. His costume was an exercise in anonymity. A pair of dark gray cargo pants, a plain black hoodie, and a simple, disposable medical face mask he could buy in a box of 50. He was no one. A shadow, a flicker at the edge of perception. That was the goal. Tonight was different. For 6 months he had trained, researched, and prepared. His notebooks, no longer for the future but now titled with cold, functional labels like Volume 1, Quirk Weaknesses, Musidifu Ward and Volume 2, Environmental Exploitation Escape Routes, were filled. His gear was ready. The ghost was tired of haunting his own room. It was time to walk the streets. He waited until he heard the soft click of his mother's bedroom door closing for the night. Slipping into his gear was a practiced, silent ritual. He moved through the darkened apartment like a wraith, exiting not through the front door, but through his bedroom window, which he meticulously oiled to be soundless. He landed on the soft grass of their small back garden with barely a whisper of displaced air. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant, ambient hum of the city. He pulled up his hoodie and adjusted his face mask, the thin fabric a barrier between Izuka Midoriya and the world. He clipped the bulky grappling launcher to his belt and slipped a handful of smoke pellets and ball bearings into the deep pockets of his cargo pants. In another smaller pocket, he carried a cheap, burner smartphone. Its only function was an app that illegally streamed the local police and emergency service radio frequencies. He didn't have a destination. He was hunting for a pattern, for a cry for help that fell between the cracks. He scaled the fire escape of a nearby apartment building, his movements slow and deliberate. Reaching the roof, he crouched behind a ventilation unit, the gravel crunching softly under his reinforced soles. From here, he had a view of several blocks. He was just another part of the city's angular, nighttime silhouette. For 2 hours he just listened and watched. The scanner crackled with mundane calls, a noise complaint, a fender bender, A suspected shoplifter at a 24-hour convenience store that was quickly handled by a passing patrol car. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic rhythm of anticipation and terror. Was he really doing this? Could he do this? The face of death arms swam in his mind's eye. Liability. He shook his head, forcing the word away. Analysis required a clear mind. Then he heard it. It wasn't on the scanner. It was a sound carried on the wind, thin and sharp. A woman's scream, cut short. It came from an alley 2 streets over. Instinct, honed by months of relentless training, took over. He didn't hesitate. He ran, his footfalls silenced by his modified boots, his body low to the ground. He reached the edge of the roof and peered down. The alley was narrow, sandwiched between a closed laundromat and a small accounting firm. The only light came from a single, flickering fluorescent bulb above a service door, casting long, distorted shadows. He saw them. A well-dressed couple, a man and a woman, were pressed against the brick wall, their faces masks of pure terror. Towering over them was a brute of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with a thick neck and arms like tree trunks. His hands were disproportionately large, the knuckles swollen and rocky. Minor gigantification quirk, Izuku's mind supplied instantly, the analysis cold and immediate. Likely limited to extremities, a common low-tier strength type. Look at the strain on his jacket seams, not a full-body transformation. Slow. Predictable. He's blocking their only exit to the main street. The service door behind them is likely locked from the inside. Just give me the wallet and the fancy watch, and nobody gets hurt, the villain growled, his voice a low rumble. He flexed one of his enormous hands, the knuckles grinding together with a sound like shifting stone. The man, trembling, fumbled to get his wallet out. The woman was clutching a designer handbag to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Izuku felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made his vision sharpen. This was it. This was the test. His mind raced, processing variables, running through scenarios from his notebooks. Option 1, direct engagement. Negative. Villain possesses superior physical strength. My gear is for defense and misdirection, not assault. Direct combat is suicide. Option 2, alert authorities. Viable, but time-consuming. Response time for a low-priority mugging could be 5 to 10 minutes. The crime will be over by then. The objective is to save them now. Option 3, misdirection and extraction. He scanned the environment. The alley was a dead end from the couple's perspective, but not from his. Above the villain, on the opposite wall, was a fire escape. To his right, at the mouth of the alley, was the street, currently empty. He noted the large glass window of the laundromat. An idea sparked, dangerous and brilliant. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. His palms were sweating inside his reinforced gloves. He was terrified. He was more terrified than he had been in the underpass, because this time, the choice was his. He could retreat. He could slip away and no one would ever know he was here. He could go back to his room and spend the rest of his life analyzing failures from a safe distance. Or he could act. He saw the woman flinch as the villain reached for her purse. And in that moment, the ghost of Izuku Midoriya made his choice. He unclipped the slingshot from his belt, a high-powered model he'd bought from a hunting supply store. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing not around a ball bearing, but around a small, sharp piece of gravel from the rooftop. A ball bearing was too clean, too traceable. A rock was just a rock. He took a deep breath, the cheap mask filtering the dusty air. He pulled back the elastic band, his arm trembling slightly. He aimed not at the villain, but at the large plate glass window of the laundromat across the street from the alley's entrance. He centered himself, calculated the trajectory, and let go. The stone flew, a small, dark blur in the night. It struck the window with a sharp crack that exploded into a deafening crash of shattering glass. It worked perfectly. The villain spun around, his head snapping toward the sudden, violent noise. What the hell? Cops? He snarled, taking a few steps out of the alley to peer down the empty street. That was the opening. In that brief moment of distraction, Izuku leaned over the edge of the roof, directly above the alley. His hand was already holding one of the modified smoke pellets. He pulled the small pin, and with a flick of his wrist dropped it. It landed silently on the grimy pavement, right between the villain and the terrified couple. For a second, nothing happened. Then it erupted. A thick, billowing cloud of gray smoke instantly filled the narrow space, smelling of sulfur and burnt chili. The couple cried out in surprise, blinded. The villain, turning back, roared in anger as the acrid smoke hit him. "What is this? I can't see!" He coughed, his eyes watering furiously from the pepper irritant. Now came the final piece of the plan. The psychological element. Izuku cupped his hands around his mouth, altering his voice, making it deeper, rougher. "He's cornered! Move in! Apprehend on sight!" He yelled into the chaos. The effect was instantaneous and profound. To the disoriented villain, blinded by smoke and deafened by the recent crash, it sounded like a coordinated police ambush. He wasn't dealing with one mugging victim anymore. He was surrounded. Panic overrode aggression. "Screw this!" he bellowed, and charged blindly out of the smoke cloud, away from the alley and the disembodied voices, and sprinted down the street, disappearing into the night. He was running from a ghost army that existed only in his mind. The smoke began to clear. Izuku watched as the couple, coughing and blinking, looked around in confusion. The villain was gone. They were safe. The man grabbed the woman's hand, and without a second thought, they ran in the opposite direction, their footsteps echoing down the street until they too were gone. The alley was empty. A profound silence descended, broken only by the gentle hiss of the dying smoke pellet and the distant city hum. Izuku stayed crouched on the rooftop, his body trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a hollow, buzzing feeling in its wake. He had done it. It had worked. His analysis, his gear, his strategy, it had all worked. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't engaged anyone. He had manipulated the situation, controlled the environment, and saved two people without ever being seen. A wave of something powerful and terrifying washed over him. It wasn't the bright, sunny joy he had always imagined heroes felt. It was a dark, grim satisfaction. It was the feeling of a perfectly solved equation, a successful experiment. It was the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of purpose. He could hear the distant wail of sirens now, likely responding to the broken window alarm. It was his cue to leave. He scrambled back from the edge of the roof, his movements swift and sure. He didn't use the fire escape he'd climbed. That was the obvious route. Instead, he used his grappling hook. He braced himself, aimed for the ledge of the taller building across the street, and fired. The launcher roared a loud, mechanical chunk WHRR, and the hook shot out, biting into the concrete ledge with a shower of sparks. He held on tight as the winch engaged, pulling him across the gap in a dizzying, terrifying arc. He landed clumsily on the other roof, rolling to absorb the impact, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. From there, he was just a shadow, melting back into the cityscape, moving from rooftop to rooftop until he was several blocks away. He descended a rusty fire escape in a quiet residential area and slipped back into the sleeping streets. He didn't re-enter his apartment until he was certain no one had followed him. Back in his room, he stripped off his gear, his hands shaking so much he could barely unlace his boots. He sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness, the only light coming from the moon filtering through his window. He had crossed a line. He knew it. He was a vigilante. A criminal. He had broken a dozen laws tonight. But two people were safe because of it. They would go home to their families. They would sleep in their own beds. There wouldn't be a statistic in one of his notebooks. He looked at his hands, at the calluses and the faint scars. They were not the hands of a hero. Not the kind the world celebrated. They were the hands of a ghost, a phantom who worked in the dark places the light couldn't reach. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But for the first time since the day his dream had died, it was accompanied by something else. A frightening, powerful sense of rightness. This was his way, and he would walk this path alone. The city at 2 a.m. was a different beast. By day, it was a bustling metropolis of heroes and civilians, a vibrant stage for grand battles and public spectacles. By night, it was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, where smaller, uglier things crawled out of the cracks. This was Izuku Midoriya's world now. He was a creature of the liminal spaces, the forgotten rooftops and the silent, trash-strewn alleys. His life had settled into a stark, demanding rhythm. Day was for enduring. He was a phantom in the halls of Aldura, a ghost at his own dinner table. He absorbed information, studied, completed his homework with a detached efficiency that left his teachers both impressed and vaguely unsettled. He was a model student on paper, a hollow shell in person. Night was for living. Or rather, for working. The moment his mother's light went out, his own mission began. The ritual was always the same. He'd spend an hour on physical conditioning, his body a machine he was constantly trying to upgrade. Push-ups until his arms screamed, sit-ups until his core burned, and pull-ups on the sturdy frame of his window until his calloused hands throbbed. He was building endurance, not bulk. He was training to run, to climb, to endure, to disappear. The next phase was maintenance and research. He would meticulously clean and check his gear. The grappling launcher's winch mechanism was a constant source of anxiety. He disassembled and oiled it every 3 nights. He'd restock his smoke pellets, his fingers nimble as he packed the irritating powder into the small casings. Then came the true work, hours spent in front of his glowing monitor, the police scanner a constant, low hiss in his ear, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he cross-referenced crime reports, city blueprints, and quirk registration databases he accessed through back-alley data brokers online. His notebooks multiplied. They were no longer numbered fantasies but a growing encyclopedia of urban warfare. Volume 3, Common Criminal Quirks Non-Lethal Counters. Volume 4, Infrastructure Weaknesses by District. Volume 5, Pro-Hero Patrol Schedules Blind Spots. They were his Bible and his armory, filled with cold, hard data. His first intervention had been a success, but it had also been a baptism by fire. The trembling adrenaline hangover had lasted for 2 days. But beneath the fear was that cold, grim satisfaction. He had made a difference. He had imposed order on a small corner of chaos. And that feeling was a drug more potent than any fear. He began to patrol, not in the heroic sense of walking the streets, but as a silent observer from the rooftops. He was a shepherd watching his flock from the mountains, unseen and unknown. For weeks, his interventions remained small, surgical strikes on the periphery of crime. A purse snatcher's path was suddenly blocked by a randomly tipped-over trash can. A would-be vandal trying to spray paint a storefront was scared off by the sudden, piercing shriek of a car alarm that Izuku had triggered with a carefully aimed pebble hitting its hypersensitive windshield. These were small acts, insignificant in the grand scheme of the city's crime rate, but they were his training ground. Each one was a successful test of a hypothesis. Each one honed his timing, his aim, his understanding of human psychology. He learned to read the subtle body language of a predator, the nervous energy of a victim. He learned the rhythm of the city's darkness. His first major escalation came a month after his first intervention. He noticed a pattern on the police scanner, and in minor crime reports, a string of high-end car thefts, all targeting the same luxury sedan model, the Tsuya Apex. They were happening in affluent neighborhoods just outside the patrol radius of major hero agencies. The police were classifying them as isolated incidents, but Izuku's analytical mind saw the connections. Same model, same method of entry, bypassing the electronic locks without breaking a window. It screamed of an organized ring with a specialist. He spent 3 nights researching the Tsuya Apex. He found its schematics online and discovered a flaw in the keyless entry system's firmware, a vulnerability that could be exploited with a specific radio frequency amplifier, a device that could be built with off-the-shelf electronics. This wasn't a smash-and-grab operation, it was professional. He couldn't confront them. He couldn't stop a theft in progress. So he decided to find their nest. He bought the cheapest, smallest GPS tracker he could find online with his carefully saved money. It was no bigger than his thumb. His plan was simple, and incredibly risky. He needed to plant the tracker on a target car before it was stolen. He spent the next 2 nights on rooftop stakeouts in the most likely neighborhood, a quiet, wealthy residential area. He was a gargoyle perched on a slate roof, enduring the cold night wind, his eyes scanning the sleeping streets below. On the 3rd night, he found it, a gleaming black Sia apex parked in a dim, secluded driveway. The approach was the most nerve-wracking thing he had ever done. Descending from the rooftops, he felt exposed, vulnerable. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a shout. Every distant dog bark sent a jolt of panic through him. He moved in a low crouch, sticking to the shadows of hedges and fences. He reached the car, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He slid underneath the vehicle, the cold pavement shocking through his thin shirt. With trembling fingers, he affixed the small, magnetized tracker to the car's undercarriage, tucking it away where it wouldn't be seen. Then he vanished, melting back into the shadows and returning to his rooftop perch. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed. Just as the first hints of dawn threatened to break his cover, a nondescript van rolled silently down the street and parked. Two figures emerged. One stood lookout while the other approached the apex, holding a device that looked like a souped-up tablet. A few moments later, the car's lights flashed, and the doors unlocked with a soft click. Izuku didn't move. He just watched as they slipped inside and drove the car away, followed by the van. He watched them steal his bait. Back in his room, the sun now rising, he opened the tracking app on his burner phone. A small red dot blinked on the map. It was moving towards the industrial district by the docks, a sprawling, forgotten area of abandoned warehouses and rusted shipping containers. The dot finally came to a stop inside a large, windowless warehouse. He had them, but what to do with the information? An anonymous call was too risky. They could trace it. Walking into a police station was out of the question. He needed a method that was as untraceable as he was. The outline mentioned leaving notes. It was dramatic, but it was also secure. No voice, no digital trail. He booted up his old desktop computer, one he rarely used, and opened a basic word processor. He typed out the note, his language clipped and precise, devoid of emotion. To Musudafus South Precinct, recent city apex thefts, not isolated incidents. Organized ring. Targeting firmware vulnerability in keyless entry. Chop shop and base of operations located at Dockside Warehouse 7, Nishikeiyu. Estimated 4 to 6 operatives, likely armed. Exercise caution. He printed the note, wearing his gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. He cut the words out and pasted them onto another sheet of paper, a classic ransom note style, to avoid any possibility of tracing the printer. He folded the sheet and placed it in a plain white envelope. The delivery was the final piece of the puzzle. That evening, he watched a police patrol car park outside a ramen shop. The two officers went inside for their dinner break. It was a risky window, but his only one. With his heart in his throat, he slipped out of a nearby alley, approached the car from its blind spot, and slid the envelope through the narrow gap at the top of the driver's side window, letting it fall onto the seat. Then he was gone, his feet pounding the pavement as he disappeared back into the night. He watched the news with his mother the next day, his face a mask of placid indifference. And in a major bust last night, Musudafu police raided a warehouse in the Docklands district, uncovering a sophisticated car theft ring, the news anchor reported. Police say they were acting on a confidential tip. They recovered over a dozen stolen luxury vehicles and arrested 6 individuals. An incredible piece of detective work. Inko sighed with relief. Oh, that's wonderful. It's so scary to think people are doing things like that. The police are just so reliable. Izuku just hummed in agreement, his eyes fixed on the screen. He felt that familiar, cold satisfaction flicker within him. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was the simple, clean feeling of a successful outcome. He had moved the pieces, and the board had resolved in his favor. As Izuku's operations grew more complex, the whispers began. In the grimy, smoke-filled backrooms of dive bars and illegal gambling dens, stories started to circulate among the city's low-level criminals. They were strange, paranoid tales. A lucrative drug deal in an abandoned subway station was suddenly swarmed by police, moments after all the lights had inexplicably shorted out. A protection racket fell apart because the enforcer, a man with a minor intimidation quirk that made his voice supernaturally fearsome, found his throat completely numb after drinking from a water bottle he'd left unattended for a minute, a bottle Izuku had laced with a tasteless, fast-acting numbing agent used for dental procedures. These incidents were disconnected, bizarre. The underworld had no single figure to blame. Instead, a superstition began to grow. They called him the ghost of Muzurifu, or the Jinx. They spoke of a phantom that brought bad luck, a malevolent spirit that soured perfectly good crimes. The police, however, were starting to see a pattern. They were the ones finding the strange clues left behind, the sabotaged equipment, the anonymous type notes that were beginning to appear with unnerving regularity. They had a different name for him, born from the sheer, baffling detail in his tips. They called him the Analyst. And no one was more obsessed with the Analyst than Detective Naomasa Tsukachi. Tsukachi was a man who believed in facts, in evidence, and in the fundamental truth of people. His quirk, human lie detector, had shaped his entire worldview. To him, truth was a tangible thing, a vibration in the air, a certainty in his gut. He could look a person in the eye and know their heart. This Analyst's case was a personal affront to everything he stood for. It was a mystery without a face, a voice, or a single person to interrogate. He sat in his small, cluttered office late one night, the room smelling of stale coffee and paperwork, staring at a corkboard that had become his obsession. It was covered in case files. The car theft ring. The sudden arrest of a villain with a wall-phasing quirk, a capture made possible only because a note left for Tsukachi himself had detailed the villain's next target, and his specific weakness to high-density foam insulation, a fact not even the quirk registration database had listed. And a dozen other smaller, stranger cases. Look at this, Tsukachi mumbled to himself, tapping a photo of the note from the phasing villain case. Subject's quirk, phase shift, is ineffective against non-Newtonian or high-density polymer materials. Recommend lining target vault with industrial insulation foam to trap him mid-phase. Who talks like that? It's not criminal slang. It's not police jargon. It reads like a scientific abstract. He picked up another file. It detailed the raid on the drug deal in the subway. The report noted that the electrical junction box for that entire section of the tunnel had been expertly rewired to short out on a timer. It wasn't just smashed. It was manipulated with a terrifying degree of technical knowledge. His partner, a weary but competent detective named Akai, leaned against the doorframe. Still trying to chase our ghost, Naomasa? He's not a ghost, Akai, Tsukachi sighed, running a hand through his tired hair. Ghosts don't understand electrical engineering or the material weaknesses of rare quirks. This is a person. One person, and he's brilliant, or she, Akai offered. Could be a rogue hero. Someone with an intelligence quirk who got tired of the red tape. I don't think so, Tsukachi said, shaking his head. My gut says no. A hero, even a rogue one, would have a certain style. A flair. This is different. This is cold. It's clinical. Look at the results. Crime stopped, property recovered, villains apprehended. But the methods are all indirect. Misdirection. Sabotage. Information warfare. Our analyst never, ever engages. He sets the stage, gives us the script, and then vanishes before the curtain even rises. Tsukachi's quirk was screaming at him, not with the confirmation of a lie, but with the profound, frustrating absence of information. It was like trying to feel the shape of a vacuum. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that the notes were telling the truth. The information was pure, unfiltered fact. And that was the most terrifying part. The analyst was never wrong. So what's your profile? Akai asked, genuinely curious. Tsukachi leaned back in his chair, staring at the web of connections on his board. Extremely high intelligence. Likely a teenager or a young adult, given the tech-savvy nature of some of the tips and the almost obsessive, fanish level of detail about quirks. But they have the cold pragmatism of a veteran strategist. They're a walking contradiction. He stood up and began to pace the small office. And that's what scares me. This person is playing a game that would get most pro-heroes killed, and they're doing it with no powers, no backup, and no official support. They are saving lives, yes, but they are also a civilian operating in a war zone. It's only a matter of time before their luck runs out. It's only a matter of time before they analyze a situation perfectly but run into a variable they couldn't account for. A second villain, a stray bullet, a collapsing building. He stopped and looked Akai in the eye, his own gaze filled with a grim certainty. I'm not trying to catch the analyst to put him in jail. I'm trying to catch him to save his life. He created a new file folder, scrawling a title on the tab with a black marker. It was a formal acknowledgement of the phantom he was hunting. Classified file, Informant 7 the analyst. Miles away, the subject of that file was crouched on a different rooftop, completely unaware of the file that now bore his name. Izuku was listening to the police scanner through a cheap earbud, his gaze sweeping over the sleeping city below. The successful capture of the phasing villain was being reported, the dispatcher's calm voice a stark contrast to the frantic beating of his own heart. He felt the grim satisfaction, as always. But tonight, it was tinged with something else. Loneliness. He was succeeding. He was proving Death Arms wrong. He was proving everyone wrong. He wasn't a liability. He was an architect of justice, working from the blueprints of his own mind. But he was utterly, completely alone. There was no one to share the victory with, no one to understand the terror and the triumph. He was a secret, a whisper, a ghost. He pulled out his burner phone. On the screen was a map of the city, dotted with pins of different colors. Red for violent crimes, blue for thefts, yellow for quirk-related disturbances. It was his private war room. He saw a new cluster of yellow pins forming over the past week in a neighboring district. A series of small, contained explosions, all using a similar chemical signature, all targeting ATMs. A bomber. His eyes narrowed. The work was never done. He pulled up his hoodie, the fabric casting his face in deep shadow. He was the analyst. He was the ghost. He was a boy named Izuku Midoriya, and he had a job to do. Alone in the vast, sleeping city, he began to analyze the new pattern, his mind already calculating, planning, preparing for his next intervention. The whispers would continue, and he would continue to give them something to talk about. The rain was coming down in cold, relentless sheets, plastering Izuku's cheap black hoodie to his skin and turning the grimy rooftops of the Kamino ward into slick, treacherous plains of tar and gravel. Every drop felt like a tiny hammer, a percussion instrument in a symphony of misery. He was cold, he was soaked, and he was in trouble. His target tonight had been a low-level information broker known as Static, a man with a quirk that allowed him to intercept and decrypt short-range electronic signals. Static had been selling hero patrol schedules to local villain gangs, leading to a recent spike in organized robberies. Izuku's plan had been textbook analyst, create a diversion, plant a data-wiping virus on his main server via remote access point, and leave an anonymous tip for the police detailing his location and crimes. The plan had gone perfectly, right up until the point where everything went horribly wrong. The diversion worked. The virus was deployed. But as Izuku was making his escape, a variable he hadn't accounted for appeared. Static wasn't working alone. His muscle, a villain with a simple but effective quirk that let her adhere to any surface like an insect, had been waiting on an adjacent rooftop. She had seen him. The chase had been frantic. She was faster on the vertical surfaces, scuttling up walls with an unnerving, spider-like grace. Izuku had relied on his parkour, his knowledge of the urban landscape, and a desperate, panicked prayer. He had finally managed to gain some distance, and now he was making his final move to get clear of the area. He stood at the edge of a 4-story building, the alley below a dark, rain-slicked chasm. The next roof was 20 feet away. Too far to jump. This was a job for his grappling hook. He unclipped the bulky, homemade launcher from his belt. It felt heavy and clumsy in his wet, numb hands. The rain was getting into the mechanism, and he prayed it wouldn't short out. He braced himself, aimed for a sturdy-looking chimney on the opposite roof, and pulled the trigger. The launcher roared to life with its familiar chunk WHR. The hook shot out, a metal claw trailing its carbon fiber wire. But instead of the solid, reassuring thump of it catching, there was a sickening crack. Izuku's blood ran cold. He looked at the launcher in his hands. A hairline fracture in the cheap plastic casing around the winch motor, stressed by months of use and the jarring recoil, had finally given way. The motor seized, the wire went slack, and the hook fell limply, clattering onto the rooftop 20 feet away with a sound of utter failure. He was stranded. His primary escape tool was broken. And he could hear the faint, scuttling sound of the wall-clinging villainous closing in. Panic, hot and sharp, flared in his chest. Liability. 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 The word screamed in his mind. He was trapped. He had overextended. He had failed. Desperation took over. He couldn't go down. He couldn't go back. He looked around wildly and his eyes landed on a rusty, corroded drain pipe running down the side of the building. It was his only chance. He holstered the useless launcher and scrambled towards the pipe. He gripped it, the rusted metal flaking under his gloves, and began to climb down. It was slow, treacherous work. The pipe was slick with rain and algae, and it groaned under his weight. He was halfway down when he heard a triumphant shout from the roof above. "There you are, you little rat!" He didn't look up. He just moved faster, his descent becoming a controlled fall. He was 10 feet from the ground when the pipe, weakened by years of decay, finally gave way. There was a hideous screech of protesting metal, and the section he was clinging to ripped away from the wall. Izuku fell. He landed hard, his ankle twisting sickeningly underneath him. A blinding, white-hot lance of pain shot up his leg. He cried out, a choked, guttural sound of pure agony. He had landed in a pile of overflowing trash bags, which had cushioned his fall just enough to prevent a worse injury, but his ankle was broken. He was sure of it. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming. The villainess was already halfway down the wall, moving with predatory speed. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. This was it. The end of the analyst. He was going to be caught, unmasked, exposed as a quirkless, reckless child playing a game that was too big for him. Then he heard a new sound. The roar of a motorcycle engine, coming down the alley fast. A single, powerful headlight cut through the rain and gloom, pinning both him and the descending villain in its bright, unforgiving beam. The motorcycle screeched to a halt a few feet away. The rider, clad in heavy, black leather gear and a full-face helmet that obscured their features, killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the rider swung a leg off the bike and stood up. They were tall, lean, and radiated an aura of dangerous competence. Well, a voice drawled from behind the helmet. It was female, with a low, smoky timbre. "What do we have here?" A spider and a broken little bird. The wall-clinging villain froze, her eyes wide. "Who the hell are you? A hero?" The rider chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "God, no. Heroes are too flashy. And they have to fill out paperwork." She took a step forward, and from a sheath on her back, she drew a long, collapsible metal staff. It extended with a series of sharp, metallic clicks. "I'm just a concerned citizen who dislikes seeing a 2-on-1 fight. Especially when one of you is already down. It's bad form," the villainess sneered. "This is none of your business. Buzz off, or you're next." She dropped the rest of the way to the ground, landing in a low crouch, and lunged at the rider. What happened next was a blur of brutal efficiency. The rider didn't move with flashy grace. She moved with violent purpose. She sidestepped the lunging attack, her staff a blur. There was a sickening crunch as the staff connected with the villainess's knee, followed by a sharp crack as it struck her elbow. The woman went down with a scream of pain, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. The rider then delivered a swift, precise kick to the side of her head. The villainess went limp, unconscious. The entire fight had lasted less than 5 seconds. Izuku stared, his own pain momentarily forgotten, his analytical mind reeling. No quirk detected. Pure skill. CQC expert. Uses leverage and joint manipulation. Brutal, efficient, disabling strikes. Not a hero's takedown. A professional's. The rider stood over the unconscious villain for a moment before turning her attention to Izuku. She walked towards him, her boots splashing in the puddles. The intimidating, full-face helmet swiveled to look down at him, its dark visor hiding her eyes. "You're the analyst, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. Izuku's heart stopped. How? How could she know? He had been so careful. The diversions, the anonymous tips, the chaos you sow, the woman continued, her voice calm and even. "It has a certain, intellectual signature. I've been tracking your work. It's clever, reckless as hell, but clever." She crouched down in front of him, the single headlight of her bike creating a harsh silhouette. "That piece of junk on your belt," she said, nodding towards his broken grappling hook. "Homemade?" Izuku could only manage a weak, pained nod. "Thought so," she said. "The design is ambitious, but the materials are garbage and the construction is amateur. You can't run a high-torque winch motor in a cheap plastic housing. It'll tear itself apart. You're lucky it didn't explode in your hand." She reached out and, before Izuku could react, gently prodded his injured ankle. He hissed in pain, instinctively trying to pull away. "Yeah, that's broken," she diagnosed clinically. "You're done for the night. And probably for the next few weeks." She stood up. "The police will be here in 5 minutes. I tripped the silent alarm at the bank on the next street over before I came down this alley. They'll find little Miss Spider here. You, however, need to disappear." She offered him a gloved hand. "Can you stand?" With her help, Izuku managed to get to his one good foot, his arms slung over her shoulder for support. The pain in his ankle was a roaring fire. Who are you?" he managed to gasp out. "A freelancer," she said simply. "I do private security, information retrieval, sometimes a bit of pest control. You've been making waves, analyst. Disrupting the ecosystem. Some people are getting nervous. Some people are getting interested. I'm in the second group." She helped him limp towards her bike. "You have a brilliant mind for strategy, but your gear is a liability. It's going to get you killed. If you're going to keep playing this game, you need an upgrade. A serious one." They reached the motorcycle. With surprising strength, she helped him get onto the passenger seat. "Hold on tight," she said, swinging her leg over and starting the engine. It roared back to life, a deep, throbbing sound that vibrated through Izuku's bones. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the engine's growl. "To see a specialist," the rider replied, and then they were moving, accelerating out of the alley and into the rain-swept, anonymous streets of the city, leaving the unconscious villain and the broken grappling hook behind. The ride was a blur of pain and confusion. Izuku clung to the mysterious rider, his face pressed against the cold leather of her back, the city lights smearing into neon streaks. She navigated the streets with an expert's confidence, taking a winding, indirect route that left him completely disoriented. Finally, they pulled into a dimly lit industrial park, a place of silent warehouses and defunct factories. She drove the bike down a narrow access road and stopped in front of a large, corrugated steel garage door. It looked abandoned. She killed the engine and helped him off the bike. She punched a code into a small, grimy keypad on the wall, and the garage door rumbled open, revealing not a dusty, abandoned space, but a chaotic, vibrant, and utterly brilliant explosion of a workshop. The air smelled of ozone, hot metal, and burnt sugar. Wires snaked across the floor like metallic vines. Workbenches were buried under mountains of circuit boards, dismantled gadgets, and half-finished inventions that pulsed with faint lights. Blueprints and schematics were taped to every available surface, and in the center of it all, illuminated by the harsh glare of an overhead work light, a figure was hunched over a workbench, a welding mask pushed up on her head, revealing a mess of pink dreadlocks. She was humming loudly and off-key to the thrash metal music blasting from a pair of huge speakers. "Hatsum!" the rider called out over the music. The figure, May Hatsum, spun around. Her eyes, magnified to a comical degree by a pair of yellow lens goggles, widened in surprise. "Kendo! You're back early. Did the new audio dampeners work? Did you get good field data on the..." She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze falling on the dripping, injured Izuku being supported by the rider. "Who's the drowned rat?" The rider, who Izuku now knew as Kendo, pulled off her helmet. She had sharp, intelligent features, and her dark hair was cut in a short, practical style. She looked to be in her late 20s. "He had a little accident." "Meet the analyst." May Hatsum's magnified eyes zeroed in on Izuku. She pushed her goggles up onto her forehead, revealing sharp, curious golden eyes with a strange, crosshair pattern in the pupils. She bounded over to them, her movements filled with a manic, boundless energy. "The analyst? The ghost? The guy who keeps giving the cops those super-detailed cheat sheets?" she asked, her voice a mile a minute. "I read about you on the forums. They say you're a data wraith, an info phantom." Oh, this is exciting. She circled him like a shark, her eyes taking in every detail. His soaked clothes, his cheap, reinforced gloves, the broken launcher still clipped to his belt. She didn't seem to notice or care about his broken ankle. She was only interested in his gear. Is that a homemade grappling hook? She squealed, pointing at the launcher. Can I see it? Oh, please let me see it. Without waiting for an answer, she unclipped it from his belt and held it up to the light, her expression one of fascinated horror. Oh, my sweet babies! This is a disaster. The housing is all wrong, the power-to-weight ratio is a joke, and you're using a carbon fiber weave that's at least 2 generations out of date. How did you not lose an arm? Kendo sighed. That's why we're here, Hatsum. He's got the brains, but he's got 0 resources. His equipment is a death trap. Izuku, still leaning on Kendo, his head spinning from the pain and the sheer sensory overload of the workshop, finally found his voice. I don't have any money. May waved a dismissive hand, already starting to unscrew the casing of his grappling hook. Money is boring. Money is for clients who don't have ideas. I have enough of those. You, she said, pointing a screwdriver at him, you're different. Kendo told me about you. You analyze things. You see the flaws. You understand the why behind the what. That's way more valuable than money. Kendo helped Izuku over to a rickety stool. I've been keeping an eye on him for a few weeks, she explained. I run into his handiwork every now and then. This is the first time I've seen him in real trouble. He needs proper support gear if he's going to survive. Izuku stared at Kendo. You've been following me? Observing, she corrected. There aren't many independent operators in this city. It pays to know who's who. You're good, kid. But you're quirkless, aren't you? Izuku flinched, a cold dread washing over him. It was the question he'd been running from. He nodded mutely. To his astonishment, neither of them laughed or pitied him. May just looked up from her tinkering, her eyes gleaming. Quirkless. Oh, that's even better. That means you have to rely purely on tech and brains. That means my babies are the star of the show. It's the ultimate test case. Kendo nodded in agreement. A quirk is a crutch. It makes you predictable. Your quirklessness is what makes your strategies so creative. You're not trying to overpower anyone. You're outthinking them, but your thoughts need better tools. This was not the reaction he was used to. For the first time since that day in the underpass, he was being looked at not as a liability, but as a challenge. An opportunity. He looked around the workshop, truly seeing it for the first time. It was a wonderland of applied science. He saw hydraulic bracers, boots with what looked like miniature hoverpads on the soles, and what appeared to be a helmet with at least a dozen different optical lenses. This wasn't just a garage, it was the bleeding edge of support technology. The pain in his ankle was a dull, throbbing reminder of his failure. His limitations had been laid bare tonight. His cheap gear, his lack of resources, they were going to get him killed. He had been arrogant, thinking he could do it all himself. Here's the pitch, kid, Kendo said, her tone all business. Hatsum here is the best damn support gear engineer who isn't working for a major hero agency or a government contractor. She's a genius, but she needs data. Real-world, high-stress field data on how her inventions perform. She needs to know how they break, where their limits are, and how villains' quirks interact with them. May nodded enthusiastically, not looking up from her work on his mangled grappling hook. Data is my lifeblood. My fuel. My everything. And you, Kendo continued, her gaze intense, are a walking data analysis machine. You can provide her with the kind of detailed, strategic feedback she can't get anywhere else. You can tell her not just that a device failed, but why it failed in that specific situation, and how it could be improved to counter a dozen other potential threats. Izuku's mind was racing, connecting the dots. You want an alliance? Exactly, Kendo confirmed. A symbiotic relationship. You become Hatsum's personal field tester and analyst. In exchange, she builds, maintains, and upgrades your entire kit. You get access to professional-grade, custom-built support gear that will keep you alive. She gets the best RD feedback loop on the planet. It was an incredible offer. It was the solution to the very problem that had almost ended his career, and his life, tonight. It was a lifeline. But it meant trusting someone. It meant letting people into his secret world. He looked at Kendo, the professional freelancer who fought with brutal precision. Then he looked at Meihatsum, the manic genius who was already sketching out a new design for his grappling hook on a stained napkin, muttering about magnetic anchors and high-tension recoil dampeners. They were outsiders, just like him. They operated in the gray areas the heroes didn't touch. He looked down at his throbbing, broken ankle. The evidence of his failure. The proof that he couldn't do this alone. Okay, Izuku said, his voice quiet but firm. I'll do it. Mei let out a whoop of delight, throwing his old launcher into a scrap bin with a loud clang. Excellent. We'll start with a new wire launcher, of course, and impact-absorbing boot soles to prevent, well, that, she said, gesturing to his ankle. And upgraded smoke pellets with adjustable density. Oh, and I have a great idea for a multi-spectrum listening device that looks like a button. We'll call you, the Ghost Protocol. We'll workshop the name, Kendo said dryly. She then pointed to his ankle. But first, we need to deal with that. Hatsum grabbed the medical kit. The one with the good stuff. As Mei rummaged through a large metal case, producing antiseptic wipes, bandages, and a lightweight composite splint that looked like another one of her inventions, Izuku felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation creeping into his chest. For the first time in 6 months, he wasn't completely alone in the darkness. He had found his way into a necessary, dangerous, and brilliantly mad alliance. The analyst was no longer a solo act. He now had a team. And with their help, he was about to become far more effective, and far more dangerous, than he had ever dreamed. The next 6 weeks were a blur of pain, healing, and rebirth. Kendo, whose real name Izuku learned was Itsuka, though she insisted he stick with her professional handle, was a surprisingly competent medic. She set his ankle with Mei's high-tech splint, a marvel of lightweight polymers and adjustable pressure, and laid down the law. He was benched. No patrols, no rooftop sprints, no field work until the bone was fully healed. For anyone else, this would have been a frustrating period of inactivity. For Izuku, it was an opportunity. He couldn't be the analyst in the field, so he became the analyst in the lab. Meihatsum's workshop became his second home. Kendo would pick him up on her motorcycle late at night, and he would spend hours in the chaotic, buzzing sanctuary, his world shrinking to the space between the workbenches. The alliance, forged in desperation, quickly solidified into a strange but remarkably effective partnership. Izuku, unable to physically test the gear, instead became Mei's chief diagnostician and conceptual designer. He would sit for hours with her blueprints, his crutches leaning against the table, his analytical mind firing on all cylinders. He didn't just look at her designs, he stress-tested them in his imagination, running them through hundreds of simulated combat scenarios drawn from his encyclopedic knowledge of quirks. This new wire launcher is incredible, Hatsum-san, he'd say, pointing a pencil at a complex schematic. The magnetic anchor is genius, it negates the need for a physical hook in most metallic environments. But what about non-metallic surfaces? Concrete, stone, wood? If the primary anchor fails, the system needs a reliable secondary. Have you considered a cartridge-based projectile anchor? A hardened piton launched by a compressed air charge. It would be louder, a last resort, but it provides a fail-safe. Mei's eyes, magnified by her goggles, would widen. A fail-safe. Of course. Redundancy. My babies need to be prepared for anything. More options. I love it. She would then scrawl frantic notes onto the blueprint, her manic energy fueled by his precise, logical input. He dissected her other inventions with the same ruthless efficiency. He analyzed her impact-absorbing boot soles, suggesting a new gel polymer that would harden upon impact but remain flexible otherwise, providing both stealth and protection. He helped her refine the chemical compound in her smoke pellets, creating 3 distinct types: simple visual obscurants, potent irritants for disabling opponents, and a thermal version that would block infrared vision. Each of his suggestions was backed by meticulous research, data sheets, and tactical analysis. He was, as Kendo had predicted, the perfect RD partner. He wasn't just a user, he was a co-creator. He understood the why behind every piece of gear, the specific problem it was designed to solve, and the dozens of other problems it might encounter. In return for his brain, May rebuilt him from the ground up. By the time his ankle was fully healed, he had a new arsenal. His old, clumsy grappling hook was replaced by 2 sleek, wrist-mounted wire launchers. They were silent, powered by compressed gas, and featured May's new dual-anchor system. His boots were now custom-fitted, the soles containing the impact-hardening gel, allowing him to drop from heights of up to 30 feet without injury and move with the silence of a cat. His black hoodie was now woven with a special polymer fiber that was resistant to tearing and offered minor protection from blades. His gloves had reinforced knuckles and fingertips embedded with sensitive microphones, allowing him to listen through doors by placing his hand against them. The cheap smoke pellets were replaced by a bandolier of small, professionally crafted canisters. He also had a new tool, a set of small, disc-like gadgets he and May had dubbed echoes. When thrown, they could adhere to any surface and emit a variety of pre-recorded sounds on a delay: a gunshot, a scream, a police siren, perfect for sophisticated diversions. He was no longer a boy in a hoodie with scavenged junk. He was equipped. He was efficient. He was dangerous. Kendo oversaw his physical rehabilitation, her training methods as brutally practical as her fighting style. She taught him basic joint locks and throws, not to win fights, but to create openings to escape. She drilled him on situational awareness, forcing him to identify every exit, every potential weapon, every surveillance camera in a room within seconds of entering. "You're not a brawler, analyst," she would say, easily reversing his attempt at a wrist lock and putting him on his back. "You're a ghost. Your primary weapon is your brain. Your secondary weapon is the environment. Your body is your last resort, a tool to get you back to using your first 2 weapons. Never forget that." The night he was finally cleared for field duty felt different. As he suited up in his new gear, the weight of it was comforting, not cumbersome. It felt like a second skin, an extension of his will. The Alliance had transformed him. He was faster, quieter, and more capable than ever before. He was ready to escalate. Shota Aizawa, the pro-hero known as Eraserhead, lived on caffeine and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. He was a creature of the night, an underground hero who thrived in the dark alleys and shadowy corners where the flashy, primetime heroes never ventured. His quirk, Erasure, was a powerful equalizer, but it required line of sight and was useless against mutant-type quirks or overwhelming numbers. As a result, he had long ago perfected a fighting style that relied on stealth, strategy, and his iconic capture weapon. He was, in his own way, an analyst of combat, and for the past 2 months, something had been bothering him. It was a ghost in the system. A whisper. He'd first noticed it through the underground hero network and his contacts in the police, like Detective Sakachi. Small-time crimes were being derailed with an almost supernatural efficiency. Villains were being apprehended in ways that defied simple explanation. A note here, a piece of sabotaged equipment there. Aizawa had initially dismissed it as the work of a new, stealth-based hero trying to make a name for themselves. But the pattern was too clean, too bloodless. There were no grand takedowns, no dramatic confrontations. Just carefully orchestrated chaos that always seemed to benefit law enforcement. Sakachi had a name for the source, the analyst. Aizawa found the whole thing intriguing, but it wasn't his problem. Not until it started happening on his turf. He was tracking a new drug ring that was pushing a dangerous quirk-enhancing narcotic called Boost. The dealers were low-level thugs, but the operation was sophisticated. They used a network of couriers, and their main distribution hub was mobile, changing location every night to avoid detection. For a week, Aizawa had been painstakingly gathering intel, trying to pinpoint the location of their next major transaction. He'd finally gotten a solid lead. A deal was going down tonight in an abandoned pachinko parlor in his patrol sector. He was perched on a rooftop across the street, a shadow among the neon signs and air conditioning units. The parlor was dark, its windows boarded up. He could see 2 lookouts stationed at the entrance, their eyes scanning the street. His plan was simple: wait for the buyers to arrive, let the transaction begin, and then drop down and disable everyone before they even knew what was happening. His quirk would negate the dealer's powers, and his capture weapon would handle the rest. It was a standard Tuesday night. He was about to move when he saw it. A flicker of movement on the roof of the parlor itself. It wasn't one of the dealers. It was a small, dark figure, moving with a fluid silence that made even Aizawa, a master of stealth, raise an eyebrow. The figure was clad in a dark hoodie and cargo pants. No flashy costume. No agency logo. Vigilante, Aizawa thought, his jaw tightening in irritation. Amateurs playing hero were a perennial headache. They were reckless, untrained, and usually the first ones to get hurt, forcing him to divide his attention between the villains and the rescue. He prepared to intervene, to stop this idiot before he got himself killed. But the figure didn't charge in. Instead, they crept to the edge of the roof, right above the main entrance where the two lookouts stood. The figure lay flat, disappearing from Aizawa's line of sight. A moment later, a small, dark disk fell from the roof and landed silently on the awning above the lookouts. Aizawa frowned. What was that? A minute passed. The buyers arrived, a trio of nervous-looking men in a beat-up sedan. As they got out and approached the parlor, the disc on the awning suddenly came to life. Freeze! Police! Hands in the air. The voice was loud, distorted, and echoed through the street. The lookouts, startled, spun around, their hands instinctively going for their weapons. The buyers, panicking, immediately tried to scramble back into their car. At the same moment, the lights inside the pachinko parlor, which had been off, flickered on, flooding the boarded-up windows with a strobing, disorienting light. Then the parlor's old, tinny sound system roared to life, blasting incomprehensible, distorted noise at a deafening volume. Chaos erupted. The lookouts were yelling, confused. The buyers were trying to peel out, their tires screeching. From inside the parlor, Aizawa could hear shouts of panic and anger. The deal was blown. The dark figure on the roof chose that exact moment to act. Two silent, thin wires shot out from their wrists, latching onto a flagpole on Aizawa's building. The figure launched themselves into the air, swinging across the street in a graceful, silent arc, landing on the rooftop not 20 feet from where Aizawa was crouched. Aizawa was already moving. This was no amateur. The coordination, the use of misdirection, the custom gear, this was the analyst. And he was on Aizawa's turf. You're done, Aizawa growled, his voice low. He activated his quirk, his eyes flaring red, his hair rising around his head. He launched himself forward, his capture weapon shooting out like a nest of white pythons, aiming to ensnare the vigilante completely. This was the moment that Aizawa's professional curiosity turned into stunned disbelief. The analyst didn't try to fight back. He didn't try to use a quirk. Aizawa could feel that the boy had none to erase, a startling fact in itself. Instead, the vigilante reacted with a speed and precision that was almost precognitive. He didn't look at Aizawa. He looked at his shoulders. He anticipated the launch. The moment Aizawa's capture weapon shot forward, the analyst dropped, not backwards, but sideways, rolling behind a large ventilation unit. The white cloth of the capture weapon hit the spot where he had been a split second before, wrapping around empty air. He predicted the trajectory, Aizawa realized, a flicker of professional respect warring with his irritation. Aizawa was already retracting his weapon, closing the distance. He rounded the vent unit, expecting to have the vigilante cornered. The boy was there, but he wasn't cowering. He was already in motion. As Aizawa came into view, the analyst tossed a handful of small, metallic objects onto the rooftop floor between them. Ball bearings. Aizawa's years of experience saved him from a nasty fall. He instantly adjusted his footing, his boots sliding slightly on the treacherous surface but maintaining his balance. It was a cheap, effective trick, and it had bought the analyst another precious second. In that second, the analyst had launched another wire, this one aiming for a water tower on a taller, adjacent building. He was already swinging away, a silent phantom against the night sky. Not so fast, Aizawa muttered. He was faster on the rooftops than almost anyone. He gave chase, his body a blur of black cloth, leaping from ledge to ledge, his capture weapon always ready. The pursuit was a high-stakes, three-dimensional chess match across the rooftops of Kamino. The analyst was fast and agile, his new gear clearly giving him an edge. His movements were efficient, economical. He never took an unnecessary step. He used the environment with a familiarity that was unsettling. He would swing around chimneys to break line of sight, kick off billboards to change direction unexpectedly, and slide down slanted roofs to gain speed. But Aizawa was a pro-hero. He was relentless. He slowly but surely began to close the gap. He knew these rooftops better than anyone. He knew the shortcuts, the angles. He finally saw his chance. The analyst had landed on a flat, open roof with very little cover. A dead end. Aizawa landed behind him, his capture weapon held ready. Nowhere left to run, kid. It's over. The analyst turned, his body language tense. He was breathing heavily, the cheap medical mask doing little to hide his exertion. Aizawa kept his quirk active, his dry eyes burning from the strain. He needed to keep it active. Even though he'd sensed no quirk, he couldn't be sure. There were rare emitter types that had no physical tell. He couldn't afford to take the chance. The vigilante slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Aizawa narrowed his eyes, suspicious. It was too easy. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The analyst nodded slowly. And as he began to turn, Aizawa noticed something. The kid's eyes weren't looking at him. They were looking just past him, at the large, glowing neon sign of a hotel on the building behind Aizawa. It flickered erratically. Tokyohotl, and Aizawa remembered a crucial detail from his years of fighting villains. A detail he had learned the hard way. His quirk, erasure, required a clear, unbroken line of sight to his target. It was a constant effect. But there was one weakness. One unavoidable biological reflex. He had to blink. It was for less than 1/10 of a second. But in a fight, 1/10 of a second is an eternity. The analyst had been waiting for it. He must have been timing the flicker of the sign, or perhaps he'd just been waiting, watching Aizawa's eyes with an intensity that was chilling. The moment Aizawa's eyelids closed, the analyst exploded into motion. He didn't attack. He threw something at Aizawa's face. Not a weapon, but a small canister. It burst open in a cloud of thick, white smoke, not the irritant kind, but a simple, dense obscurant. Aizawa's line of sight was gone. His quirk deactivated. Simultaneously, the analyst launched both of his wire launchers, not upwards, but downwards, off the edge of the building. Using the momentum, he didn't swing away, he rappelled, dropping out of sight into the dark alley below. Aizawa coughed, waving the smoke away from his face. He rushed to the edge of the roof and peered down. The alley was dark, empty. A faint metallic clang echoed from the street at the far end of the alley, followed by the sound of running footsteps that quickly faded. He was gone. Aizawa stood on the edge of the rooftop, the cold night wind whipping at his costume. He was breathing heavily, not just from the exertion of the chase, but from a profound sense of shock and grudging admiration. He had been completely outplayed. The vigilante, this analyst, hadn't beaten him with a quirk. He hadn't beaten him with strength. He had beaten him with Aizawa's own weapon, analysis. The kid had known his quirk. He had known its limitations. He had known about the blink. He had prepared for it. The ball bearings, the smoke bomb, the strategic retreat. Every single move had been a calculated counter to Aizawa's specific fighting style. He hadn't just been running. He had been leading Aizawa into a position where his own weaknesses could be exploited. Shota Aizawa was not a man who was easily impressed. But as he stood there, listening to the approaching sirens, no doubt an anonymous tip about the disrupted drug deal was already being processed. He felt a chill run down his spine. This analyst was not just a reckless vigilante. He was a prodigy. A quirkless boy with a mind that could dissect a pro-hero's entire career in a matter of seconds and devise a successful escape plan on the fly. That level of intelligence, untethered to any law or authority, was more dangerous than 1,000 street thugs with flashy quirks. Tsukachi was right. This kid needed to be found. Not just to stop him, but to understand him. And perhaps, as the detective had said, to save him from himself. Because a mind that sharp, operating alone in the darkness, was a blade without a handle. Sooner or later, he was going to cut himself. Aizawa pulled his goggles back down over his eyes. His hunt for the analyst was no longer a matter of professional responsibility. It was now personal. He had been challenged, he had been beaten, and he needed to know who was behind the mask. The ghost now had his full, undivided attention.